Hello and welcome to this video, and today I'm going to be showing you how to set up your very first V-Ray scene inside Blender. In a previous video I showed how you can go ahead and install the new V-Ray for Blender, and in this video we'll be looking at how you can get started with the render settings, the lighting, some of material settings, and just having a final image output. To get started, we have this simple asset, and we'll go to our render setting and switch this from V-Ray from Cycles to V-Ray. We can go ahead and add a camera object, and if we press Ctrl-Alt-0 from any view, it's going to position the camera to face that view. So we can just quickly position this. Let's do like let's flip the resolution and just make it look nice. I will give this like 35. That's a nice, interesting scene. Maybe we duplicate this. Just to make it interesting. Okay, so now we have our V-Ray, and if you've installed it correctly, we can just click on render. So the V-Ray frame buffer should pop up any second from now, and here we go. So currently we see nothing because there's no lighting, and let's fix that. So the great thing about this new V-Ray iteration, if compared to the previous one, you have nice viewport render. So we can click on this viewport preview render, and it will load the viewport render in the scene. So we can go to add, and in the add we can add let's say a react light, and once we lift it we can start seeing the light, and we can adjust some settings. Let's actually start something. We'll start by, let's create like an HDRI. So there are a couple of ways you can create HDRI with V-Ray. So the first one is to just add a simple light, and we add a dome light. Okay, and we can now go to the V-Ray node editor, and we switch this to shader and use light nodes. Okay, while we're here, we want to search for texture, bitmap texture. So in V-Ray they call the image texture the bitmap texture. So we'll connect the color to the dome color. So we can go to anywhere you have your HDRI saved. I have mine saved here, so we can just call on this, and there we go, we have our HDRI. So this is one way of creating it. If you want to use the world settings, I'll be showing that in a bit, but while we're here you can rotate the dome to rotate the lights. So this is quite helpful in most situations. So let's hide this for now, and let's go to the world settings. So I have my old cycle settings, so we can click on use V-Ray world settings, and we see nothing. So you're going to see this V-Ray environment. So if you check on any, it's going to enable that setting. So if you check on the background, we can switch the background color to something desirable. For the GI, which is basically the global illumination, we can use it to add our HDRI. So as we did earlier, we can go ahead and add a V-Ray bitmap. So we'll open what we did previously, and we should be able to find that same texture right here. So we want to connect the color to the GI, and there we go, and we can also connect the color to the background. So for the mapping, we want to go to mapping, and we want to grab the UWV mapping, and we can set this to environment and hit map. So by default it's set to spherical. We can choose different ones like angular, spherical, mirror ball. So you have different options here. To control it, we can go ahead and search or in the utilities, I think, or we could just search for transform, and we can connect the transform onto the transform, and here you can transform the rotation, rotate it on the y-axis. We can also use an empty object to control it. So if we add a simple sphere, and let's increase the scale of this slightly, and we can search for object. So we want to get the V-Ray object select, and we'll select the empty and then connect it. So now if we rotate this empty, we will rotate the HDRI and scale it up, we can scale it in. So for this instance, we're just going to use the V-Ray dome light. And if I'm not wrong, I think it supersedes, once you have that, it supersedes the environment light. Okay, so we can start by using the dome light as a base. So let's go to our camera view. Let's bring up another scene because we want to add another light. So we'll use this dome light or environment light as the fill light, but we need a nice key light. So for that, we'll use a react light. So we can bring this up and rotate this nicely. So it's a bit blown out. For that, we can reduce the intensity to like 10. So we just want to highlight the key object, and we can create like a rim light. So we are currently seeing a light in the 3D viewport, which, or in the render, which is not nice. So we can make it invisible. It's going to hide it from the render. So we can use this to just create like a nice interest in the background. If it works, if not, we'll check it out. Okay, so for this, we're going to reduce it to like 2, or maybe 3. We don't want it to be so distracting. So let's bring back the dome light. So we can control the intensity. So we'll reduce that to 0.3. And now let's give this a test render. So it's rendering and it's taking some time. We'll let it do its thing. Almost done now. So as we can see, the type of rendering it's using currently is something called the progressive render. I will be showing you the settings next on how we can optimize this even better. Okay, so it's not perfect. We still see some noise, and it's not the fastest, at least for this iteration. So let's go over some of the render settings. So what V-Ray key main strength, or the key feature which V-Ray brings into production, is the scalability. And this works because it exposes a lot of settings that allows you to create both hyper-realistic and very stylized or non-realistic render. And this means that you can get renders that take days, or you could get render that takes minutes. So these are all the settings, which is a bit more cumbersome, or at least they seem more, they are a lot compared to cycles. So let's go over the image sampler. I will try to just distill it down to the important things you need to know. So I did mention the render which we just had was based on the progressive sampler. So if we want to get like cycles render, we will switch this to bucket render. So when we hit render, it's just going, you know, those nice squares we get kind of going through the image and rendering. This is how we switch it to the bucket. So for this log subdivisions, it's basically cycles. I think cycles used to have a settings before Cycles X. Um, but basically, this minimum and maximum samples, that's what we have here. So if you want to just use one sampling for the entire image, basically adaptive subdivision, or if you don't want to use adaptive subdivisions, then you can set like a one fit all samples, so like 10. So every part of the image pixel will be rendered with 10 samples. But if we switch this to, if we unlock it, so we can say the minimum subdivision of the renderer, we can set it to 1 and the maximum to 24. This will give us a relatively faster render. If you want something quicker, you can reduce this to 5. So the lower, the more noise, but faster. So let's give a reasonable 20. Noise limit is kind of same with adaptive subdivision, so you could get away with this value or you could reduce it to 0. Firefly, of course, we know Firefly. Just little hot spots we find in the render, those from noise. So we'll look at the anti-aliasing feature. This is pretty standard. It basically means like anti-aliasing. If you can look into that if it's not clear enough, but the way it's arranged, it's basically optimized to not optimized. So if you set it to none, there's no anti-aliasing, which could minimally add to the render final, but the higher the better quality. So we can, I think the default for Blender is box, and you can switch it to, if we go to film, so we can see the pixel filter, which is basically anti-aliasing. We have box, but V-Ray seems to offer more. So if you're just test rendering, you can set this to box, and it's a nice way to just kind of test. When you're done and you want a higher quality, then you can probably increase it to one of this. So by default it's set to Laxo. I pronounce it, I'm very bad with that. Yeah, so for the pixel size, it's still same settings to control that. Let's move on to the animated noise pattern. So if you're basically, if you don't want to get one pattern of noise, then you can click on animated noise patterns. So this is just basic settings for the sampler. Like I mentioned, we'll just look, I'll be distilling into the important ones. So let's go to the GI, which is global illumination. So you could turn off global illumination, and if we try to render, you don't get light bounce, but you get faster render. So without the global illumination, it's gonna still render, but yeah, we can look at here, this part is dark. If we enable it, the light kind of spreads out. So it depends on your needs. And then we have two global illumination engine, which is brute force and light cache. So the light cache, which is default, is realistic enough. It gets the job done, but it's faster, but not very realistic. Because it's approximating things. If you want to get more realistic, then you have to switch to brute force, and it has less settings. So the higher the depth, the more the quality. I think it's basically like light path, if I'm not just making shit up. So if you're looking for faster render, then you do light cache. But if you want highly realistic, then you use brute force. Those are the main settings to kind of optimize your scene. These are other settings for like displacement, some light settings, materials and stuff. So if you just understand this tool, that should give you a very nice point to start making changes. Next, we want to go to, you can switch this to GPU. But unlike cycles, certain features might not work well with as well as CPU as it does. It might not work as well in GPU as it works with CPU. The main culprit for that is if we switch this to shader. So by the way, once you select this node editor, everything you need for the V-Ray node editing is all here. So you can switch to object and world. So for the shader, it's object based. So let's say we will use the use V-Ray material for this, so we can delete the cycle stuff. And my goal is to show you kind of one point where the CPU and GPU shows some difference, at least in this situation. So if we add a simple bitmap texture, and let's say we bring up like a random pattern. Let's use this one. So we can connect this to the diffuse, and if we search for mapping, with CPU we can scale this. So if we set this to 12 by 12, we can see it scales nicely. We can rotate this 90 degrees or 180, and let's say we do 50. So it works, but if we switch to the GPU, we lose that ability. So yeah, you lose. So if you want to scale this, you would have to go to the UV editor and actually scale the UV of the object. That's just so I suspect there might be one or two cases where this comes up, but for this situation, let's scale this. We can create a custom UV for this object, and we scale this 50 times. So we kind of have that. I mean, it introduced a new like stuff to your workflow, but just get the job done, especially if you want to use the GPU. Okay, so where are we? We've looked at the settings, and most of stuff here are standard. So let's go ahead and create a simple material. But before we do that, we can look at one more thing, which is pretty important in render settings, which is denoising. So if we go ahead and render this, so it's almost done now. So this is it without denoising, but because we checked on denoising, it's going to denoise the image. I don't know if they have optics denoiser. So if we select the denoiser, so if you make any changes, you can update it. So you have option for mild, default, or strong. So if you want to get real strong denoiser, so the default is probably good, so you don't have a lot of splodges. Well, you can reduce the effect of the denoiser because it tends to be applied as a filter on top of everything. Yeah, so that's how you can apply the denoiser. And you still, yeah, you have access to like other cool stuff. So if you want to get that filmic look and reduce the highlights, you can turn this down, the highlight button, and we can get like a curve and then make our own settings. So this is one cool advantage. You kind of use it almost like a compositor. Anyways, so this is good. It should have loaded back into Blender. Yeah, so that's the denoiser. You have access to lots of passes if you need that. So it's well integrated in Blender. So let's go into the material setup. So I've kind of glanced over it. But if we bring up the preview and we switch this to V-Ray node editor, so we have our material here and we've converted it to V-Ray. So if you have a Cycles material, or if let's say you create a new material, let's go for this object. So we create a new material, and you will not see any parameter here. All the parameters are right in the node editor. So we can set the viewport, the background color to something dark. Give it some bluish tint. I think highlight light might come, rim light might come in handy now. Can probably increase this to like 15. Okay, so we have our background. So if we want to add a bit of reflection in the, so we can increase the reflection color, so it brings in the reflection. For the roughness, we'll reduce this. For cycles, is the opposite direction, I think. No, I think it's, yeah, it's the opposite direction because, or not. If it's 0 in cycles, it's fully shiny. Yes, it's the opposite direction. So if we set this to 0.4, it becomes a bit more rough. If you want to use roughness, because this is using glossiness, most of the settings in V-Ray nodes, if you go to the nodes, you have more options right here. So you can even switch the type of BRDF you're using. So the default is just GGX. So you can switch that. You can switch this to roughness too, but I'm just going to leave it as default. Okay, let's quickly create one for the leather. So we'll set this color to black. Okay, so let's bring in some reflection, and then we'll set the roughness to like 0.4. I'll make this a bit darker. So we can add some sheen with the sheen color, kind of like cycles. In the sheen glossiness, so if we set this to 2, should be less. So maybe 0.9. Okay, and let's bring this. Somewhat of a bluish tint. Okay, I think we'll increase the reflections a bit more. We'll set the diffuse roughness to 0.5. So for bump, like every render engine, you have both just your basic bump and your normal map. So for this instance, we want to just create a basic bump, so we can connect the color to the bump map, and we will reduce the bump amount to very low value. Seems to be quite reactive to bump map, so go very low. So this seems appropriate. And for the stool, so we switch just to use V-Ray material, and we'll set the reflection color to white, and then we'll set the metallic to 1. Maybe we'll add some roughness to the metal, so 0.9, so something like this. I have not attempted this, but we can attempt to see if we can do depth of field. So in the yeah, I was kind of doing some tests in the background, but I think there's probably something we'll not be saying today. Maybe it'll be a different video. I'll figure that out. But yeah, I like how this is looking. Let's go over like some of the settings to make sure everything is set. So set this to 1. If you want to save an output of your image, we can just quickly do a test. 1, so we'll call this render. So we'll accept that. So right frame number, that's if you're rendering out animation. Or elements to folders. So if you want to organize it to different folders, we can set name for the project. For this, you cannot use like video. You can render out video. You can only render out image sequences. So use JPEG for now, but you have options for PNG. So you can save out alpha. So the alpha of the image, you can save that out. So next we'll go to the render settings. So we'll set it to bucket. For the final render, we can use like 50. It's gonna be slower, but it's fine. We probably don't need animated noise pattern. For GI, we're using brute force. We'll probably increase this to like 10. We will look into caustic in another video. But yeah, that's the only thing we need to set up. So we have GPU, and we can bring up the frame buffer by clicking that. So let's stop this, and let's give it a final render. So it's almost done. Don't know if it gives information about the time, but yeah, this is the final render. Looks pretty nice. So in more videos, we'll be doing more specific asset. Today I wanted to do a bit more generalized tutorial of touching different sections of V-Ray broadly. But yeah, this should get you started in setting up your render. So we can adjust some of this to do an extra composition. So this is our render. If it looks different than it does in V-Ray, we can go to you can go to your color management. So I have mine set to AGX. I will set it back to standard and none. So it should look like what it does in V-Ray. So it also saves out, since we kind of set up a path for this, so we can look at it. So it's going to save out the render passes for us if we select a folder out an output folder. So you have your denoised image, and you have your noisy image. If you want to save out more passes, so we still have our alpha. If you want to save out more passes, you basically, in the render channel, you basically want to basically enable everything you want to set up. So you have a lot of controls being exposed, a lot more than what Blender gives you. So this is becomes quite powerful to kind of do composition later. So that will be it for this video. I hope it was intuitive and you picked up 1 or 2 skills. Let me know what you want to see in the video, in the next video, in regards to this topic, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe. So bye bye for now, see you next time.